in the late 1970s, in a quiet suburb called Des Plaines, Illinois, concealed a nightmare. Behind the smile of a well-liked businessman and part-time clown lurked a predator whose crimes would horrify the nation. John Wayne Gacy wasn't just a trusted neighbor. He was a serial killer who buried his victims beneath his own home. And when investigators uncovered the truth, it shattered the illusion of safety under defined the face of evil. This is a story of how a troubled child became one of America's most infamous serial killers, and why his legacy still haunts us today, known by all now as the Killer Clown. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murders. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too. You sick, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. And today we are talking about just that monstrous pos person, John Wayne Gacy. A lot of you recommended I do this, so you get what you wish for. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this killer clown case together. John Wayne Gacy's early life was marked by a tumultuous family dynamic and personal struggles that would later shape his psychological development down the road. Born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, Gacy was the second of 3 children and the only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson. His father, a World War I veteran, struggled with alcoholism and subjected young John to frequent verbal and physical abuse. And this abusive relationship just set a precedent for the toxic dynamic that would persist throughout Gacy's childhood and adolescence. And the paternal abuse Gacy endured was not merely sporadic. It was a constant presence in his formative years. Not a good start. His father consistently belittled him and drew unfavorable comparisons between John and his sisters. And this persistence of degradation had a very profound impact on Gacy's self-esteem and his perception of masculinity. And one particularly poignant incident occurred when Gacy was just 4 years old. His father would beat him for accidentally disarranging car engine components, an event that Gacy would recall as one of his earliest childhood memories. And this incident just exemplified the harsh and unforgiving nature of his father's treatment, which often centered around perceived failures and inadequacies. So, just the first ingredient in our serial killer stew, okay. Nature, nurture. Nurture bad, bad, bad. But in contrast to his father's cruelty, Gacy's mother, Marion Elaine Robinson, attempted to shield her son from the abuse. So that's good at least. However, this protective behavior inadvertently fostered a deep-seated resentment in Gacy towards both his father and expectations placed upon him. And the dichotomy between his parents' treatment created a very complex emotional landscape for the young Gacy, one that would influence his interpersonal relationships and psychological development in the years to come. And Gacy's childhood would be further complicated by a series of health issues. He developed a heart condition that led to frequent hospitalizations. And rather than his father offering him support, like a good dad does, his father just accused him of feigning illness for attention, just deepening the rift between the two. And this lack of paternal empathy during times of physical vulnerability likely contributed to Gacy's feeling of isolation and inadequacy. And the extent of Gacy's health problems became more pronounced during his teenage years. Between the ages of 14 and 18, he spent nearly a year in hospitals due to unexplained blackouts and a burst appendix. Kid had it rough, Before he was an absolute monster pos that deserves to be in hell. Do feel bad for the kid, And these prolonged periods of hospitalizations really affected his education and social development. So the physical ailments combined with the emotional trauma of his home life, this created the perfect storm of psychological stress during his formative years. And at the age of 17, Gacy would experience another traumatic event that would have a far-reaching consequence for his psychological well-being. He would unfortunately be assayed by a family member, an experience he would actually never disclose to his parents. So this is just combined with everything. All the hospitalizations and all the treatment of his parents was just a recipe for disaster. Just another ingredient in the serial killer stew, if you will. But despite the abuse, the medical issues, and the saw, Gacy actually managed to maintain close relationships with his mother and his sisters, Karen and Joe, and And these familial connections provided him with some emotional support during his tumultuous childhood and adolescence. However, these positive influences in his life would not outweigh the bad. It just gets bad for me. And as Gacy entered adulthood, the effects of his troubled childhood began to manifest in complex and disturbing ways. The manipulative tendencies and violent impulses that would later characterize his criminal actions can be traced back to these formative experiences. And Gacy's childhood would also shape his interactions with authority figures and his desire for approval. As he grew older, he developed a keen ability to present a facade of normality to the outside world, a skill that would later enable him to be able to commit these crimes and get away with it for a very long time. So in 1960, at the age of 18, he ventured into the world of politics, where all good people come from. I love politicians. Working as an assistant precinct captain of a local Democratic Party candidate. And although this sounds like a really cool, impressive job, it was not met with approval from his father. Still, this guy still can't get approval from his father. He just completely dismissed his son's efforts by labeling him as a patsy. And the criticism just further strained their already tumultuous relationship and underscored the ongoing tension between Gacy and his father. So, at this point, seeking a change of scenery, Gacy relocated to Las Vegas in 1962. And there he found employment in an ambulance service before transitioning to a position as a mortuary attendant. The irony is palpable, and it was during this time at the mortuary that Gacy had a disturbing encounter that would leave a lasting impact on his psyche. He would come into contact with the deceased body of a young teenage boy, and in a moment of profound disturbance, he would embrace and caress the corpse. And this experience left Gacy in a state of shock and pleasure and may have been the pivotal moment in the development of his later pathological behavior. And then upon returning back to Chicago, Gacy demonstrated a drive of self-improvement and professional advancement. Despite not having completed high school, he enrolled in Northwestern Business College and successfully graduated in 1963. And the achievement completely opened doors for him. It secured a management trainee position with the Nunn-Bush Shoe Company, where he began to showcase his business abilities. In the year 1964 marked a significant turning point in Gacy's life. He married Marlon Myers, a co-worker of his, and relocated to Springfield, Illinois, where he excelled both in his career and community involvement. And rising through the ranks of the Springfield JCs, a civic organization, Gacy would eventually be named the vice president and would be recognized as being the third most outstanding JC in Illinois, whatever that means. So this period of his life just exemplified Gacy's ability to present a facade of normality and success to the outside world, a skill that would come in handy as he delved into the world of killing. And it was during the time that he was with the JCs, Gacy would experience another pivotal moment in his sexual development. And this moment would be a homosexual encounter with a colleague. And this event would mark a significant point in Gacy's life as he grappled with his sexual identity, a struggle that would just continue to influence his actions in those years to come. And I'm not at all saying that homosexuality led him to do these things that he's about to do in any way, shape, or form, obviously. But him questioning his sexual identity led him to confusing roadblocks in his already very confusing mind, and obviously odd fixation with dead bodies. Glad we cleared that up. Let's continue. But Gacy's ability to maintain a respectable public image while harboring deviant impulses is a classic example of a psychological concept of masking in sociopaths specifically. He became very well liked in his community, hosting large summer parties that attracted hundreds of guests, including politicians and business associates. And these social gatherings just reinforced his image as a community-minded individual, a good guy if you will, all while concealing his growing criminal tendencies. However, Gacy's carefully constructed facade began to crumble in 1968 when he was arrested for saying a teenage boy named Donald Voorhees. So this incident would mark Gacy's first criminal conviction and resulted in a 10-year prison sentence at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. Despite the severity of the crime, Gacy served only 18 months before being released early for good behavior. That's crazy. That's like 1/10, a little over 1/10 of the sentence. That's crazy. And it would be a decision that would have tragic consequences for years to come. And the impact of the conviction on Gacy's personal life was immediate and severe. His marriage completely dissolved, with the divorce being finalized while he was still incarcerated. What? So this marked the end of Gacy's relationship with his wife and children, whom he would actually never see again, which is for the best. The loss of his family and his reputation in the community he worked so hard to cultivate likely just exacerbated Gacy's psychological instability. And reports suggest that, during the time that he was in prison, Gacy's criminal tendencies continued to just manifest. I mean, the guy was just surrounded by criminals. How could they not? He allegedly even tried to hire a hitman to eliminate his accuser, who was Donald Voorhees, the teenage boy, though his plan luckily ultimately failed. And the incident just provides insights into Gacy's growing disregard for human life and his own willingness to resort to extreme measures to protect himself. So upon his release from prison in 1970, John Wayne Gacy returned to Chicago, where he initially resided with his mother. And this marked the beginning of a period of remarkable success and public acclaim for Gacy. Despite his criminal history, which is crazy, in 1971 he established PDM Contractors, a construction business that quickly flourished. And Gacy's entrepreneurship and charisma allowed him to build a respectable reputation within his community, effectively concealing his very dark impulses. And as he began to become more financially stable, he could purchase a home in Des Plaines, Illinois. In the year 1972 proved to be a very pivotal point for Gacy. He married Carol Huff, a divorcee with 2 daughters, further solidifying his image as a reformed, upstanding citizen, which, looking at it now, he absolutely just did that for the image, I imagine. He didn't give a flying shit about anybody that was around him. He just his people. And Gacy would immerse himself into community activities, volunteering for political campaigns and performing as Pogo the Clown, the Thing of Nightmares, at local events. And his involvement in these pursuits served to reinforce his public persona as a benevolent, uncivic-minded individual. But alas, he was a sick-minded individual. But that picture of him as a clown is locked in my nightmares. But in 1972, he would finally start to crumble into his violent tendencies. He would commit his first murder, and the victim was Timothy McCoy, a 16-year-old hitchhiker whom Gacy had picked up at the bus station. Gacy would lure McCoy to his home under the pretense of offering him a place to stay for the night, and in the early hours of the morning, Gacy would stab McCoy to death in his kitchen. And later, Gacy would claim that he killed him in self-defense, asserting that McCoy had attacked him with a knife. And this incident, however, marked the beginning of Gacy's killing spree, which would continue for the next 6 years. And the second murder would take place around January 1974, and this victim remains unidentified. All we know is that the person was strangled and placed in Gacy's closet before being moved to the crawl space after the body began to decompose. And all of this specific information was given as testimony by Gacy himself. And the third victim, John Butkovich, would be 18 years old at the time of his disappearance on July 31st, 1975. And John had been working for John Wayne Gacy since the age of 16. And shortly before his disappearance, Gacy and Butkovich were having money issues. And on July 30th, John and 3 friends went to Gacy's home, threatening to beat Gacy up if he didn't pay John the $300 that he was owed. Just beat him up, get some baseball bats, beat him up. But instead of paying him, Gacy let the 4 boys smoke weed and drink beers at his house. And after a while, the boys left, and eventually later that day, Gacy encountered John waving him down at his car. And following this interaction, Gacy convinced John to get into his car and he would take him back to his home. And as soon as the 2 men would enter the home, John began to yell at Gacy, demanding his check, cause beers and we didn't cut it. And Gacy would then do his mow, and he would cuff John with handcuffs, and he would tell him once he calmed down he would take the cuffs off. However, John began to threaten Gacy, saying that if Gacy cut the cuffs off him, he would kill him. And from there, his fate was sealed. Gacy would make John sit on his chest and he would lay next to him, and eventually he would just strangle him. And Gacy would plan on stashing his body in the crawl space, but his family came home, forcing him to bury John under the garage. And following his disappearance, the KallMeKris pushed for police to investigate Gacy further, but nothing was ever done, unfortunately. Which brings us to our next victim, which was Daryl Sampson, who disappeared on April 6, 1976. Now we're in a shorter cool-down period time, which tends to happen with a lot of serial killers. We have that really long one, and then it slowly gets shorter and shorter cause they get more and more impatient and more addicted to what they're doing. But at the age of 18, Daryl Sampson was invited into Gacy's home under the pretense of a construction job, but shortly after would be murdered by Gacy. Initially, it was believed that Daryl disappeared by running away, but after police entered Gacy's home, his body was found underneath the dining room. This is obviously later on, after they actually found out Gacy was a serial killer, but until they found that out, everyone thought that he just ran away. And the next victim, Randall Ruffett, age 15, disappeared on May 14th, 1976. So now we're only a month cool-down period. And he would also be discovered under the crawl space of Gacy's home during the police investigation after Gacy was caught, and his body would be identified via X-ray, and his cause of death would be a stab wound. And the next victim, Samuel Stapleton, was only 14 years old at the time of his disappearance on May 13th, 1976. Samuel had just finished spending time at his sister's house and decided to walk back before his curfew. However, he would never make it home and was reported missing the next day. And his body would also be discovered under the crawl space of Gacy's home and identified by X-ray of his head that included his teeth. And his body was also found with a metal bracelet that his family and friends later identified as his. And this bracelet was actually used in charging Gacy with the death during his trial. And next there was Michael Lawrence Bonin, who disappeared on June 3rd, 1976. At the age of 17, he was taken while traveling from Chicago to Waukegan, and his cause of death was strangulation via ligature, and his body was exhumed from beneath Gacy's spare bedroom. And next there was William Billy Carroll Jr., who was known to be kind of a troublemaker around town. According to his father, William, when Billy was 14 or 15, he was caught with a .38 Smith & Wesson automatic pistol. According to what I've learned from some of his friends, he'd shoot it at people just to scare them. He used to like to watch them run. However, on his oldest brother's birthday, June 13th, 1976, 16-year-old William disappeared and was later discovered and identified in a shallow grave in the crawl space of Gacy's home via dental records on March 17, 1979. And then there was James Jimmy Hawkinson, who was actually recently identified on July 19, 2017, via DNA match to his family. Previously known as Body 24, Hawkinson disappeared on August 5, 1976, at the age of 16. And on the day he disappeared, Jimmy called his mother to let her know that he had arrived in Chicago after traveling from Minnesota from his home. And once Gacy was arrested, James' mother contacted the police stating that her son might be one of the unidentified victims. However, at the time, the police could only use dental records to identify bodies, and James' mother just happened to not have any. It wasn't until his nephew told his father and aunt to submit their DNA to the Chicago PD that his body was then successfully identified. And the next victim would be Rick Johnston, aged 17, and he disappeared on August 6, 1976. So all of these murders are happening very, very close together. And he would disappear after his mother dropped him off at a concert. Not much is known about how Gacy and Rick met. However, we know that Rick died on August 6, 1976, and his body was found inside the crawl space buried over top of the body of James Hawkinson. So at this point, he is just stacking bodies on top of each other under his floorboards while his family is living in the same home. And just going about his life how he always does with being a fucking clown and then having his construction company, a construction company in which he found a lot of his victims. He would just tell them that they could have a job and then he'd have them over and then he'd do relatively the same thing over and over again. You know, either getting them drunk or handcuffing them, promising them jobs. It's just sick. And the fact that it took so long for them to find him is just awful. And then there is the next victim, Gregory Godzik. And there's little known about the disappearance of Gregory. All we know is that he went missing on December 12, 1976, and he was exhumed from the crawl space of Gacy's home. And investigators were able to place Greg in Gacy's home because his wallet and some of his other belongings were found there. And at age 19, John SCYC had recently moved to Chicago and was eager to start a life. However, he went missing January 20th, 1977, and later during police investigation, he would also be found in Gacy's. And then there was John Prestige, age 20, who had come to Chicago to visit a friend and eventually stayed after finding work with a Chicago contractor. And he would be last seen on March 15th, 1977, and his body would also be found in the crawl space. And I know I'm saying, victim one after another, but I think it's important to speak on all of the victims, as shocking and as sickening as it is. I don't want to breeze past any. So next we have Matthew Bowman, who was last seen by his mother at a suburban train station and reported missing by his sister July 5th, 1970. And other than his body being found under the crawl space, not much is known about how he came into contact with Gacy or how he died. And then there was Robert Gilroy, the son of a Chicago police sergeant, and he had actually grown up just 4 blocks from where Gacy lived. But investigators couldn't link any evidence as to whether that played a factor in his disappearance or death. And Robert was last seen September 15th, 1977, and unfortunately his body would also be found under the crawl space at the age of 18. And then there was John Mowry, who at age 19 completed an intense 18-month Marine training and enjoyed his time in Chicago with friends and family. And on the night of September 25th, 1977, he stopped by his family member's house and informed them that he was going out. However, according to his roommate, who worked for Gacy's construction company, his dog had been run over, and this claim would be corroborated by his girlfriend, who claimed that the last time the two had talked had been on the phone that night when Mowry went missing. And following this incident, Mowry would never be seen again. And when investigating his disappearance, his roommate was very adamant about not calling his missing roommate, which some believe meant that he knew that Gacy was responsible for Mowry's disappearance, cause that is very strange. And when investigators ended up digging up Gacy's mass grave, John Mowry's body was among the deceased in the crawl space. And among the many items that were discovered in Gacy's home, Mowry's brown suede jacket was found and used as evidence to prosecute Gacy during his trial. And next would be Russell Nelson, who disappeared on October 17, 1977, after traveling to Chicago with a friend to work for a contractor within the Chicago metro area. And investigators would never figure out whether that contractor that Russell worked for was Gacy or not. And his body would be recovered from Gacy's crawl space, and he would be 21 at the time of his death. Next would be Robert Winch, who was the son of a physics professor at Kalamazoo, Michigan, where he would live for most of his life. And then he would move to Chicago at the age of 16. And while in Michigan, he was kind of known for running away from his foster home, so when he disappeared on November 10th, 1977, it wasn't that surprising. And he would be last seen eating at a McDonald's with a friend after being dropped off by his girlfriend. And while at McDonald's, he would be approached by John Wayne Gacy offering him a contracting job, and he left the McDonald's with Gacy and was never seen again. And while investigators would later search Gacy's home, they would find his tiger's eye belt. And there was Tommy Bowling, who was 20 years old at the time he disappeared on November 18th, 1977. And at the time he was struggling with drugs and had a wife and a 3-year-old son. And his body would be recovered under Gacy's crawl space as well. And the body of David Talsma would also be found in Gacy's crawl space and was identified by x-rays on his left arm on what would have been his 21st birthdays. And his father reported him missing on December 14th, 1977. And next is William Wayne Kindred, a 19-year-old resident of 511 West Melrose Street, Chicago, and he was last seen near Diversion Broadway, where police believe John Wayne Gacy picked him up. And Kindred's girlfriend, Mary Jo Paulus, had been searching for him tirelessly since his disappearance, but his body would be later found under Gacy's house in December 1978 and was identified through dental records provided by his mother. And then there would be Tim, or RKE's body, who was actually recovered from the Illinois River and was identified through fingerprints. And when his body was found, he was completely naked, and he disappeared sometime in mid-June 1978, and his age was unknown. So clearly something happened during that encounter where Gacy maybe couldn't get him back to his home, or some sort of ordeal happened where he had to kill him on the spot and then throw him into the river. And then the body of Frank William Landingen was discovered naked in the Des Plaines River in Will County on November 15, 1878, and he was later linked to Gacy after his driver's license was found in Gacy's home. And then 20-year-old James Matsara was found 3 miles away from Timothy O'Rourke in the Des Plaines River on December 28, 1978. And not much is known about when Gacy came into contact with James, or when the first meeting was, or even when he went missing, but he was found nonetheless. Clearly Gacy found a new dumping ground because he had so many bodies under his house. And the next victim is Robert Pye Street, a 15-year-old in Des Plaines, Illinois, who disappeared on December 11th, 1978. And he was last seen in Nissan Pharmacy where he worked, telling his mother that he was going to meet a contractor for a potential job. We all know where he's going. Obviously identified later, the contractor being John Wayne Gacy. And when Robert obviously didn't return home, his family reported him missing. And his disappearance triggered an investigation that ultimately led to Gacy's arrest. And Robert's body would be found April 9th, 1979 in the Des Plaines River. And Robert's blue nylon jacket was found inside Gacy's home, linking his death to Gacy's. And all of those victims that we just covered are all the ones that have been successfully identified. To this day, there are still 5 unidentified victims that police are working diligently to identify. There were 8 unidentified victims found as well at his property. DNA from the scene was unable to be extracted from them, and they just continue to be unnamed. But Gacy's ability to maintain a double life during this period was remarkable. He continued to be an active member of his community, hosting large parties and participating in local politics. And his construction business was thriving during this whole time, providing him with both financial stability and the means to act as potential victims. And the contrast between Gacy's public persona and his private actions was very stark, illustrating his capacity for manipulation and deception. And as years progressed, Gacy's crimes became increasingly brazen. He began to take greater risks, sometimes committing murders while other people were present in his home. And this escalation and risk-taking behavior would just ultimately contribute to his downfall. Despite his efforts to conceal his crimes, suspicion began to arise within his immediate circle. His second wife, Carol Hoff, reported finding wallets belonging to young men in their home and noticing a peculiar odor emanating from the crawl space. How the fuck could you not smell like 20, 30 bodies under your floorboards? I'm assuming she had her nose cauterized or so. I don't understand how you could just be like, it's probably nothing. It's probably just, probably just I forgot to do the laundry or something. I don't know. I don't even know how Gacy would play that off. Like, he would just say that he was, I don't know, refusing to shower for years and just blaming it on his own fucking disgusting body odor or something. I don't know. I don't understand how that's even possible. But I digress. But it says that every time she brought it up, Gacy would just somehow explain it away. So I can't think of anything else. He's like, oh, there's mold in the walls. And she's like, shouldn't we move? And he's like, no, we can't. So the turning point came in December 1978, when the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Pye Street was linked to Gacy. Pye Street had last been seen at the pharmacy where Gacy had been working. Witnesses reported that Gacy had offered him a job, and this disappearance would trigger a much more thorough investigation into Gacy's activities, ultimately leading to the discovery of the horrific extent of his crimes. The disappearance of Robert on December 11th, 1978, marked the beginning of the end forge on Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. So police would obviously go to Gacy's home, and the police would scrutinize Gacy, and they would uncover a series of suspicious items that raised alarms, to say the least. And these included items belonging to missing young men as well as peculiar objects that seemed out of place in a suburban household. And the mounting evidence against Gacy led to the implementation of round-the-clock surveillance on his residence. So under the weight of constant police scrutiny, Gacy's behavior became increasingly erratic. His attempts to maintain the facade of normality began to crumble as the pressure intensified. And on December 21st, 1978, the investigation reached a critical turning point when Gacy, unable to withstand the mounting pressure, made a shocking confession to police. He admitted to killing at least 30 men, a revelation that stunned even the most seasoned investigators. As everybody around Gacy, they thought he was the coolest guy, so nice, very professional, very successful, great family. How could this guy be a murderer? Basically shook Chicago. Then there was the grim task of excavating Gacy's property, which began on December 22nd, 1978. And over the course of the week, forensic teams meticulously searched the crawl space beneath Gacy's home, uncovering a horrifying scene, as you already know. And the excavation revealed dozens of decomposing bodies, confirming the extent of Gacy's murderous spree. And the process of recovering and identifying the remains was painstaking and emotionally taxing for all involved. And if we take a look at this house, it is just truly haunting. And investigators dug into his yard and realized just how many of his victims he was literally standing above at all times, which I'm sure was just a weird fucking treasure trove for him. It is sick. Just a sick bastard. I hate this guy. It's just sick. Especially with his family living on that. In the house too. Oh, makes me sick. And he lived at 8,213 West Summerdale Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. And this place became a burial site for all the victims I listed. So when investigating his home, the crawl space housed 26 bodies beneath it. And they also found a body under the garage and one in the yard. And I mean, at this point, he was literally collecting them. Not only killing them in his home, but burying them in his home. It's like he had this possession over these bodies. It was just sick. And despite the extensive efforts of forensic experts and law enforcement, several of Gacy's victims remain unidentified, as we said. And this tragic reality underscored the far-reaching impact of his crimes and the challenges faced by investigators in bringing closure to the afflicted families. And the magnitude of Gacy's crimes became fully apparent when he was formally charged with 33 counts of murder, one of the highest numbers in the United States criminal history. And the trial, which began in 1980, captivated the nation and shed light on the dark underbelly of a seemingly ordinary suburban life. Gacy's defense team attempted to mount an insanity plea, which is insanity, arguing that their client was not in control of his actions at the time of the murders. However, the strategy quickly unraveled as expert testimony consistently ruled that Gacy was sane and fully aware of the nature and consequences of his actions. I mean, you're talking about a guy that could fully function and have a full business, own a business, run a business, have a family, be well liked by everyone around them, have nothing seemingly mentally wrong with them. And then they try to get the insanity plea. It just makes me hate defense attorneys. I don't hate them all, but I mean, let's not get into that. But they should kind of be in jail anyway. Gacy's attorney, that is Zara. And the prosecution presented a mountain of physical evidence and testimony that painted a clear picture of Gacy's methodical and calculated approach to his crimes, cause every one of these crimes was so thought out and premeditated. You couldn't argue it. And the jury, having heard weeks of gruesome testimony and examined the overwhelming evidence, required less than 2 hours of deliberation to reach their verdict. And on March 13th, 1980, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death for his heinous crimes. Whether you agree with that or not, I'm not upset about it. And following his conviction, Gacy spent the next 14 years on death row, so he had to rot a little bit, which I also like. And during this time, he granted numerous interviews, maintaining his innocence in later years despite his earlier confessions. The guy just wanted attention, cause he's a little attention whore. He's a little creepy clown attention whore bitch. And it's weird to see some of the interviews because it has him having all the documents of his known victims and being able to look at them and also in confident state that he has no recollection of any of them when you know he remembers every single one of their faces and everything that he did to them. It's just, he has a very punchable face during his interviews. But the final chapter of John Wayne Gacy's life unfolded on May 10th, 1994, when he was executed by lethal injection, and witnesses to the execution reported a disturbing scene, describing what appeared to be a botched procedure, which I just call karma. The chemicals used in the lethal injection process reportedly caused Gacy to experience prolonged suffering, raising questions about the humanesses of the execution method, which is fair. I mean, he's a monster. That doesn't mean we the innocent people need to be monsters. But maybe it was an accident. And if it was an accident, listen, who the fuck cares? He killed 33 people. In his final moments, though, Gacy remained defiant and unrepentant, which just makes it like he's not as... I just don't feel bad for him. I don't feel bad for him, like even a little bit. And his last words would be, "Kiss my ass." Well, karma kissed yours, you piece of shit. But it was just his final act of contempt towards society and his victims, revealing that even in death, he showed no remorse for his actions. And now he's just rotting in the deepest depths of hell, burning every second of every day and every night. And I sleep well at night knowing that. But I digress. Gacy's psychological profile revealed a complex tapestry of disorders and motivations, cause I do like to get into that. How the hell does somebody become this tired? How do people commit these crimes and just go about their lives like nothing ever happened? His behavior exhibited strong narcissistic personality traits, evident in his manipulation of both police and media throughout the investigation and the trial. And this narcissism was even further exemplified by his lack of remorse, as he showed no empathy for his victims and even mocked their families at some points. And the question of whether Gacy suffered from dissociative identity disorder, or did, remained contentious, as he inconsistently claimed to have multiple personalities at various points during and after the trial. I feel like that was just the defense trying to say that he was insane, and this was just like a way of trying to manipulate the jury, which is just... You're not fooling me, buddy. You're dead. Who am I talking to? Not you, cause you're down there anyway. And the motivations behind Gacy's crimes were just multifaceted, extending beyond mere sexual gratification. His actions were deeply rooted in a desire for power and control, and the act of his victims begging for their lives before killing them served to reinforce his sense of dominance, something that he didn't have as a child when his father was dominating him, which I do think coincides with how he went about killing people. But this need for control may have also stemmed from his internal conflicts, particularly regarding his sexuality as well, which I'm sure is a factor. And despite being married twice, Gacy primarily targeted young men, leading some experts to theorize that he struggled with repressed homosexual urges, which may have fueled his rage and violent tendencies. And the Gacy case also led to significant reforms in law enforcement procedures, particularly handling cases of missing persons. The removal of the 72-hour waiting period for reporting missing children was incorporated into the Missing Child Recovery Act of 1984. Ultimately contributing to the establishment of the Amber Alert system, which again, just a positive out of something so huge and negative. But a 72-hour waiting period is fucking crazy. Like, even back then, I can't even think. I know a lot of kids ran away, but my lord. Gacy's crimes had a lasting impact on criminal profiling techniques, highlighting the importance of understanding the psychological profiles of serial killers. and the FBI and other law enforcement agencies have since developed more sophisticated methods of identifying and tracking potential serial offenders. And these advancements draw on insights gained from analyzing Gacy's behavior and his modus operandi, or MOMO, contributing to the evolution of investigative practices in the field of criminal psychology. But all in all, giant piece of shit that I am glad is not breathing the same oxygen as all you beautiful babies. All my beautiful babies, I just want you to be safe. I want you to be safe out there. But that is all for the John Wayne Gacy case, the killer clown case. You guys wanted me to do a deep dive, so I hope that was deep enough for you. Let me know what other deep dives you want to see down below. I always love reading the comments and seeing what you guys want to deep dive into with me. If you like the video, like the video. If you want to subscribe, subscribe. This is obviously the best YouTube channel ever. And also, what's the last thing? I will see your beautiful face in the next video. Alright, stay safe out there. Bye. In a remote village in India, a woman reported her baby missing. The police would arrive, and that's when a young boy would come forward smiling, and he would lead them right to the body. And this is not a work of fiction. As terrifying as it sounds, this is the true story of Amarjit Sada, a boy who by the age of 8 had taken 3 lives. Born into poverty, raised in silence, and driven by something even his own parents couldn't understand, Amarjit will become known as the youngest serial killer in recorded history. But his case is only the beginning. Which is horrifying, cause in this video, we are going to uncover 3 of the most disturbing cases of juvenile killers the world has ever seen, spanning rural India, suburban Canada, and the outskirts of Madrid. Children who killed without any victims, barely older than toddlers and some even younger, so trigger warning there. And crimes that challenge everything we thought we knew about psychology, justice and innocence. From the cultural stigmas that hid warning signs to legal systems unequipped for murderers in grade school. This is not just a story about murder. It's a story about what happens when childhoods turn deadly. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume. And I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. And today we are doing just that. And my lord, it's these kids. I thought I was scared of kids already, but it's about to get wicked twisted up in here. So like I said, trigger warning there. We're going to be talking about kids. It's like psychopathic children, and also obviously some of the deaths involve children as well. So just know that before going into this. But without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into these 3 cruel children together. So before Amarjit Sada ever took a life, before his name would unsettle headlines across the world, he was just a kid. He was just a child born into a system that never saw him coming. Amarjit was born in 1998 in Bokaro area, a rural district of Bihar, India. And at the time, the region was one of the most impoverished and neglected in the entire country. The infrastructure was very minimal, electricity was very unreliable, and education was a luxury to say the least. And healthcare, especially mental health care, was practically non-existent. So in these forgotten pockets of India, superstition often stood in place of science, and mental illness was just not understood at all. It was basically just feared or concealed completely, or just blamed on other entities or spirits. So families struggling with psychological disorders just didn't seek therapy. They thought something was wrong with them, and not that something very common was wrong with them, but something like was inside them and wrong with them. If that makes sense. So they would turn to local shamans, or worse, they would just do nothing at all. So the fear of public shame meant that most of these cases were just buried quietly, especially in a small, tightly woven community where reputations quite literally meant survival. In Amarjit's village, poverty wasn't just a statistic. It was basically just a way of life. So his family lived in a very densely packed neighborhood made of mud brick homes and open drains. His parents would work as laborers, earning barely enough to feed their children. But more dangerous than the poverty here was the silence. Children with any sort of behavioral issues were rarely seen as mentally unwell. They were called troublesome, moody, or simply cursed. Like actually, they thought they were cursed. And few recognized the warning signs, obviously given the lack of, and fewer still had the means to actually act on them. And so when Margit began exhibiting troublesome behavior, no one asked questions that should have come first. Questions like what the hell was going on inside Margit's mind? What's causing him to act out like this? But instead, like so many other children born into these margins, he was just left to his own world. One that was shaped by suffering, superstition, and silence. And in that silence, something very, 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 very dark began to grow. So, Margit entered the world as another child born into poverty in a village where survival came way before any sort of psychology. But long before Margit ever picked up a brick, which we'll get to, there were signs. First off, he was never liked by other children. He didn't really have any friends, cause in the village boys his age played together and swam in the pond. And when other children asked him to play, he reportedly would sometimes lash out in sudden bursts of anger at them. So they were like, whoa, okay, shit, dude, you don't have to play Marco Polo with us, like I don't know. So villagers would later describe him as strange but polite, which I find very hard to believe, but also notably withdrawn. He was very to himself. And looking back, these were the early indicators of detachment and harmful potential. And his mother, Peril, noticed the difference too. Margit just had this temper and intensity that she just couldn't explain. She didn't know where it came from. And instead of turning to doctors, she would turn to tradition. She would smear black Kyle beneath his eyes to ward off evil and placed an amulet of protection from the Hanuman emblem around his arm. But no amulet could stop what was manifesting inside this evil little child. But obviously she didn't know any better. She just thought that maybe it was an evil spirit. Maybe that this will help you know. So it's of no fault of her own. Margit would have no formal education as well. There was basically no access to structure, therapy, or any sort of guidance. Some reports even mentioned neglect from his parents. And it would be around this time that tragedy would first strike seemingly out of nowhere. Margit's infant cousin would die under suspicious circumstances, and his family would have to make a devastating choice. They would keep quiet. They would call it an accident, and they would shield him that they are responsible for. And I don't have an excuse for them, so basically they were rewarding the behavior of their murdering child. Not the best parent, but probably worst parent toward, I'd say. So with not punishing your child or not making them be held accountable, the darkness inside him would quickly unfold. So like I said, his first victim was very close to home. It was his younger cousin, and there seems to be a bit of discrepancy from various sources of the age of the victim, but his cousin was an infant. So one day the infant would seemingly vanish, and shortly thereafter her body would be found, and it was clear that she had been beaten to death. And there would be no trial, no police reports. Her family, basically Margit's family, just chose to stay silent, even though they knew that Margit had done the crime. And then not long after, his infant sister would be his next victim, and his sister would be just 8 months old. And Margit would strangle her to death with his bare hands. Like, just horrifying. But again, the family did not report the crime. And whether out of shame, fear, or just pure disbelief, they buried not just their child, but the truth. So, in 2007, the village was shaken when a third child would go missing. 6-month-old Chush Bu, the daughter of a neighbor. Her mother had left her sleeping at the local school while she just stepped away. But when she returned, the child was completely missing. And no one was prepared for the truth that had actually occurred. So the community gathered around and the search began to break out. But not long after that, Margit would step forward and he would confess very casually, even cheerfully. And officers just couldn't believe it. They thought naturally that it was a prank. I mean, this kid is 8 years old. He's a small child. How could he have done this horrible crime? And if he was to do it, maybe it was an accident. But why would he be happy about it? They were just really confused. But that's when he would lead them to the body hidden away. Her tiny body laid buried in a shallow grave. And the infant had been strangled and bludgeoned to death with a brick. And when questioned by police, Margit reportedly smiled through his entire confession and even asked for biscuits at the beginning of it. And as investigators listened, just completely stunned, he described the murder with chilling detachment. Just pure sick psychopathic behavior. He was quoted to say she was sleeping in the school. I took her a little away killed her with a brick and buried her. Just like absolutely chilling there. There's just something about a child with so much detachment that is next level horrifying. So forensic psychologists would be brought in and their official conclusion would be that Aim Arjeet was a sadist. A child who found pleasure in inflicting pain. So this was not a prank gone wrong. It was not the product of a playground fight. This was something far, far darker and far rarer. And now the world would finally take notice. A little too late, if you ask me. So when the news broke that an 8-year-old had killed 3 infants, it sent shockwaves across India and the world. But once the horror of his confession settled, authorities were left with the difficult question, what do you do with a killer child? And at the time of Aim Arjeet's arrest in 2007 India, all was very clear. A child under the age of 18 could not be tried as an adult. And there would be no prison sentence, no criminal trial, no possibility of life imprisonment, and certainly no death penalty. So instead, Aim Arjeet was placed in a juvenile detention facility, the only legal option available at the time. And there he would spend the next 10 years. The maximum sentence allowed for a minor under Indian law. And behind closed doors, rehabilitation efforts would begin. And reports suggested he received counseling, education, and behavioral therapy. But the truth is almost nothing is known about what happened inside those walls. There were no updates, sorrow interviews, and the file on Aim Arjeet Sada slowly disappeared from public view. And then in 2016, he would turn 18 years old, and under Indian law, his record was completely sealed. So with his file closed, his identity was changed to protect his future and prevent vigilante retaliation. Which I'm like, don't let that guy out. If he can do that at 8, what the fuck? Could he do it 18 years old now? What? He's in his mid-20s now. That's fucking terrifying. And today his current location is completely unknown to the public. Some say he relocated under government protection, but others believe he may have quietly reintegrated into society under a new identity. What remains is just his horrifically chilling legacy. So Aim Arjeet Sada is still confirmed the youngest serial killer in modern history. And somewhere, perhaps walking among us, he just life as a full-grown man who is a full-blown psychopathic sadist with his past completely erased and his secrets completely buried. So the question still lingers, can someone who kills before they learn to even right truly be free from who they were? To be honest, I don't think so in this case. I feel like this is pure nature. I feel like he was born with this in him, and I don't know if there's any way out of it. I mean, I hope that psychologists and professionals were able to get through to him, but that's very scary. Very, very scary. But that brings us to our next child, and that is Jasmine Richardson. So before the headlines, before the world would recoil at the idea of a 12-year-old kid, Jasmine Richardson was just a girl born in 1993 in the city of Medicine Hat, Alberta, Canada. Jasmine Richardson grew up in what most would describe as a pretty ordinary middle-class home. Her parents, Mark and Deborah Richardson, had met during recovery from substance abuse actually. So they were the people who were dead set and committed to starting over and raising a family far away from their past mistakes. And together they would build a new life. Mark was a very hard-working man. He was strict but very loving. And Deborah was known to be a very soft-spoken and warm mom and partner who stayed very involved in her children's lives. And Jasmine was their firstborn, followed 5 years later by her little brother Jacob. And the family was very close. By all accounts, they spent a lot of time together and had a lot of family outings. And by all accounts, Jasmine was very bright. She made the honor roll in her Catholic school. She performed in fine arts programs. She laughed with friends, made crafts, went to sleepovers. She kept really busy with a lot of good things. She was a pretty normal child starting out until she wasn't. So around the age of 11, something changed in Jasmine. She began gravitating toward goth subculture. And this isn't a hit on goth subculture, by the way. I know quite a few goths actually. Very cool, very awesome. But this is just kind of what segued her into what she became. So not a hit on any goths at all, just her story. So after getting into the subculture, she was kind of drawn to dark fashion, heavy eyeliner, and online communities, where she could shed the expectations of her quiet suburban world, and her MySpace and vampire freaks. Com profiles painted a very new picture of Jasmine. One where she was older, rebellious, fascinated with serial killers. Nothing wrong with that, and just purely immersed in fantasy. So the 11-year-old at this point would tell people that she was 15 and she would post poetry about death and violence and just not great stuff. And somewhere in those digital shadows she met him. Yes, there's a him. Jeremy Stinky, more like Jeremy Stinky, am I right? I'm about to be, because Jeremy was 23 years old. He was 23 years old, about to date a 15-year-old, who was actually an almost 12-year-old. So just bad news bears. And he was reportedly beaten through his childhood by his biological father and two of his stepfathers. And his mother and her various partners' husbands and boyfriends were just all alcoholics. So he had a very bad upbringing and no excuse for dating a literal child though. He was a high school dropout who believed he was a 300-year-old werewolf. So wasn't all right up there in the head. Wasn't all right. And allegedly he would wear a vial of blood around his neck and enjoyed the taste of blood as well. So he was basically everything any girl's parents would fear, especially Jasmine's parents. If that guy walked into my door when I was 11 years old and he said, "Hey dad, here's Jeremy, is 23 years old, he's a 300-year werewolf and he drinks blood," Jeremy would fly hundreds of feet in the air with the "my dad" would deliver to his ass. But anyway, I digress. So obviously, when they discovered Jasmine and Jeremy's relationship, they forbade it immediately. Did parent or duh. But for Jasmine, that only fueled the fire. So it began as a pure fascination turned into a complete obsession. And within months, the girl who once played dress-up in her childhood bedroom would be planning the murder of her entire family. So at just 12 years old, Jasmine Richardson fell in love. And this wasn't an innocent kind of love either. You know, the kind that blossoms between schooled dances and whispered secrets. Little middle school drama. This was something much darker. As I said before, Jeremy was 23 years old, which is an obvious problem for too many reasons to kill. So they met in early 2006. A friend would introduce them and Jeremy would groom her into a relationship with him basically. And online they would just build this entire fantasy world around them. They would use platforms like Nexopia and Vampire Freaks. They would exchange cryptic and disturbing messages back and forth to each other. And as mentioned before, Jasmine said that she was 15 years old and Jeremy didn't ask any questions about that. And I honestly just don't think he cared. But their messages would grow increasingly more intense. They would be very romantic, violent, and even conspiratorial. So again, after Jasmine's parents found out, they were like, "Fuck that shit, no, you cannot see that guy." And then she would be like, "Well, that just makes me want them more." So she would naturally rebel. She would start sneaking out, going to concerts, and she would continue to get in trouble from her parents. So when the barriers between Jasmine and Jeremy began to grow further and further because of her parents, they began to imagine a world without those barriers. Those barriers being her parents. "So I have this plan," Jasmine wrote in one online message. "It begins with me killing them and ends with me living with you." And shortly before the murders, they watched the film Natural Born Killers. Natural Born Killers is a violent cult classic about a couple in love who go on a killing spree. Basically, they ruined this movie for me. And Jeremy idealized it, allegedly claiming it is quote-unquote the best love story of all time. And he didn't want to lose Jasmine and he was willing to kill for her. So what followed was not just a crime of passion. It was the complete unraveling of reality itself, guided by fantasy, fueled by obsession, and executed by two people who believed they were completely untouchable. One of them believed he was a fucking 300-year-old werewolf, for freak's sakes. So it was a quiet Sunday morning in a small Canadian town of Medicine Hat when police arrived at the Richardson family household. And inside they would find a scene so gruesome and so unthinkable, it would haunt the country for years. 3 members of the Richardson family, Mark, Deborah, and their 8-year-old son Jacob, was dead, completely slaughtered in their own home, and their 12-year-old daughter was completely missing. But this wasn't a kidnapping. This was the plan. Just hours earlier, under the cover of night, Jeremy had entered the Richardson home through a basement window. He was drunken under the influence of cocaine, marijuana, and ecstasy, but he was armed with knives and fueled by obsession. So Deborah Richardson would be in bed and hear the noise in the house and go to investigate. And this is when she would encounter Jeremy. She would be startled by him in the dark, but before she could scream for help, he would attack. He would inflict multiple stab wounds on her, and there would be multiple defensive injuries caused. She was trying to fight for her life at that point. But unfortunately, she would die in the basement. But Mark would hear some sort of a struggle downstairs and go down to investigate himself. And he grabbed the first thing he could find, which was a screwdriver. But he too was completely outmatched and unprepared. And Jeremy would stab him repeatedly and just leave him to bleed out. And this is all happening while Jasmine is there participating. And then came the part that no one wants to believe. Jasmine's 8-year-old little brother. To this day, both Jasmine and Jeremy blame each other for what happened next time. So the truth is unconfirmed, but this is what we know. Jacob was stabbed multiple times and his throat would also be slashed. And there are some reports that mention he attempted to defend himself with his toy lightsaber bearer, which is just painstakingly heartbreaking. And they supposedly did this because they didn't want him to live as an orphan, or have had the burden of living as an orphan. So they did it as some sort of fucked up courtesy, which is just beyond sickening. And a neighbor would later describe the scene as straight out of a horror movie. And then after all of the horrific damage that they had done in lives that they had taken, they just up and left. And they would go to a friend's house to attend a party. And they would laugh. They would kiss. They bragged of the atrocities they had just committed. And they were, according to witnesses, celebrating. Just no words. And the next morning, Jasmine would be listed as a missing person because as far as the authorities know, she was kidnapped and her family was brutally murdered by some sort of unknown assailant. But within 24 hours, the truth thankfully would come out. And it would come out after recovering evidence from her room and more evidence online. It was very clear that she wasn't a victim. She was now a suspect. So Jasmine and Jeremy were tracked down and arrested in Leader, Saskatchewan, which was about 80 miles away. So they were making a run for it at this point, and they were driven by Jeremy's friend whose name was Casey Lancaster, and she was later charged with being an accessory for disposing of evidence. But the accessory charge was dropped, but she pleaded guilty to an obstruction charge and she would end up with a 1-year house arrest. So Jeremy and Jasmine were now in custody. And in custody, neither would show any sort of emotion. Both were charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. And in 2008, Jeremy was convicted and sentenced to 3 life sentences in prison served consecutively with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Which, like, why is it ever an option, you know? But Jasmine's trial was a little bit more complicated. She was only 12 years old at the time of the murders, after all. So this would make her the youngest person in Canadian history to be charged with multiple homicides. And psychologists testified that she was emotionally immature and likely under Jeremy's influence, and she lacked the full capacity to understand the consequences of her actions. But still, the jury found her guilty of all 3 counts. And under Canadian law, she could not be sentenced as an adult. So instead, Jasmine would receive the max sentencing for a minor, which was 10 years made up of time in a psychiatric institution, followed by conditional supervision in the community. And her sentencing wasn't just about punishment, it was about rehabilitation. But the country was completely split. Some viewed her as a child manipulated by a predator, and others saw her as just a cold-blooded killer. And there are some rumors suggesting the possibility of Jeremy actually being the victim due to fetal alcohol effects and his abuse during his own childhood, which potentially brings his intelligence and suggestibility into question. But there's no conclusive answer to this. Just an interesting twist on this whole scenario. So the trial was over, but the debate had only just begun. I don't know. I personally think it takes a certain kind of child to not feel anything for being responsible for your entire family's death. Do I think a child can comprehend the repercussions of killing their entire family? No. I think that you're in love as a really young child and you're persuaded by this older guy. I think you're willing to do anything. But I think there is a bit of nature in there and a lot of nurture as well, I don't know. He's a 23-year-old guy. Maybe he's not the most intelligent, but he's still capable of killing and not asking questions. So I think they're both equally at fault. But who am I to say that they're both guilty? So clearly majority said what I said, basically. And today you won't find Jasmine. There's no press conferences. There's no interviews, not a trace. Because Jasmine Richardson, now in her 30s, walks completely free. She served her full 10-year sentence, and in May of 2016, that sentence ended and her record was sealed and her name was protected. And she would be released from all court-ordered conditions. So during her rehabilitation, Jasmine reportedly enrolled in university classes at Mount Royal University in Calgary. And those who encountered her had no idea who she really was. She was just another student to them, just another face in the crowd. And now her exact whereabouts are completely undisclosed, and by law her identity cannot be revealed in Canadian media, shielded by the same system that once tried her as a child. So some believe she still lives near her old community, but the nation remains divided. To some, Jasmine Richardson was a success story, proof that the system can rehabilitate even the most unlikely offenders. And to others, she's just a ghost walking free, a reminder of a crime too dark to forget. But wherever she is now, she herself carries her past that cannot be erased. And that brings us to our final child serial killer, Peter Martinez Del Geyer. So in the winter of 1965, in the quiet city of Murcia, Spain would become home to one of the most chilling and least understood cases in European criminal history. And at the center of it all was a 12-year-old girl and her name, Peter Martinez Del Geyer. Born in 1953, Peter was the third of 10 children in a family struggling to survive. Her father was a bricklayer and her mother was a part-time kitchen worker and job worker. And they lived in El Carmen, a working-class neighborhood defined by its poverty, overcrowding, and hard labor. Before that, the family had lived in the slums, basically one step above desperation. There was no semblance of luxury, no privacy, only noise, hunger, and the never-ending demands of survival. And while other children her age were in school, learning to read and write, Peter was home. She cleaned and cooked and changed diapers. So at 12 years old, she was the default caretaker for her younger siblings. Jesus, who was 10, Christina, who was 8, Manuela, who was 6, Andres, who was 5, Juan Santa, who was 4, and Mariano, who was 2, and the baby Maria del Carmen, who was only 9 months old. Oh, a lot of kids. So her older brothers worked full-time as panel beaters at the auto shop. They would sometimes bring their work home and require her to help clean and polish metal parts. And they would provide her with some small bars of chemical substance in order to do this. Very important to note later. And her parents would be gone for most of the day because they too worked. So the weight of the household, the chaos of caring for 7 younger siblings, fell squarely on her very small shoulders. And she carried it quietly and obediently until something broke. And no one really noticed at first. After all, she was just a little girl. A girl who didn't go to school. A girl who couldn't really read. A girl whose entire world was confined to her crumbling walls, the wailing of babies, and the suffocating pressure of poverty. But inside her, something else was forming. Not resentment, not rebellion. Contempt. So it began with a fever. On December 4th, 1965, baby Maria del Carmen, just 9 months old, began convulsing violently. She would also develop a rash and her temperature would start to soar. And within half an hour, she would unfortunately pass away. And the family doctor arrived as soon as possible, but it was too late. And the doctor would say it was most likely meningitis. The death itself was very sudden, and this wasn't unheard of. So it was a tragedy, yes, but a very isolated one, or so they thought, because 5 days later would happen again. Mariano, only 2 years old, died under nearly identical circumstances. Families in the neighborhood began distancing themselves to protect from whatever was occurring in the household because everybody at this point just thought they were sick and most likely contagious. And then 5 days later, once again, one Santa, just 4 years old, died just as quickly as her other siblings with the same symptoms. So 3 children within 10 days, all gone. And this time the doctor refused to sign the death certificate. He did suspect something else but lacked any proof. So by the order of the local health council, the Martinez de Geyer family brought their surviving children to Mercy General Hospital for evaluation. And they would stay for several days and receive many tests. But in 1965, Spain's diagnostic technology was extremely limited. So there was no immediate answers, and the hospital would find no conclusive cause as to why those children died so suddenly. So the family would be sent home, and all of the children in the neighborhood, including the family, would receive a prescription of multivitamin concentrates. I don't think that's going to help, but the hope was to make sure their immune systems were at peak shape should there be any sort of infectious disease going on. But within days of the family's release, it would happen again. On January 4th, 1966, 5-year-old Andres was dead after having been seemingly completely okay half an hour before. And this time there would be no assumptions, and they were more determined than ever to discover the cause. Samples of visceral tissue from Andres and Fru Encanto were sent by pathologists to the Instituto Nacional del Salud in Madrid, and they completely ruled out the possibility of an infection agent. So then they would send it over to the Institute of National Toxicology, or the National Institute of Toxicology, and it was there that they would find their answer, and the culprit would be potassium cyanide and DDT. So back in Mercia, pathologists were taking a second look at the first two deceased children, but they still didn't find anything. But they reportedly fed 21 guinea pigs and a dog with pieces of the children's organs, which is, I don't know how I feel about that, but okay. And all of the animals would die suddenly, so they would know that the children were poisoned. And when the police asked who was last seen with the victims, one name came up again and again: Pete. So by mid-January 1966, the city of Mercia no longer whispered about the deaths in the Martinez de la Guia household. They fucking shouted for dead children. No explanation and no arrests at this point. Only grief and suspicion. And on January 14th, both parents, Andres and Antonio, were arrested. Authorities would suspect that the murders were an act of filicide, which is the killings of one's child. And Antonia, pregnant at the time, was confined to a maternity ward under supervision. And Andres was sent to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. And the surviving children were split. The boys housed with their father and the girls kept with their mother. A very controversial move, but one made with purpose. Detectives hoped that their killer might slip up. By now, the story had reached national headlines, and this was very out of the norm because in this period of time the press was very tightly controlled. And journalists just descended on Mercia, eager to capture the story. And what they found would completely stun everyone. The children, just weeks after burying their siblings, were laughing, playing, unsmiling. And one photographer recalled 6-year-old Manuela looking directly into his lens and saying something to the effect of, quote-unquote, "You want to take my picture because I'm going to die next." Absolutely chilling. Oh my god. And then just like that, she went back to her game like it was nothing. But behind those playful scenes, detectives were watching someone else. Someone a lot quieter than the other children. Someone a lot colder. And that was Peter. Her affect was flat. Her gaze just completely unshaken. And she always seemed to be the last one with each of the dead. But they still had no proof at this point. Then on January 24th, a detective had an idea. He took 12-year-old Pete to a local cafe, just the two of them, and he made small talk and ordered her a glass of milk. And then with a sleight of hand, he pretended to spike her drink with the same metal cleaning compound her brothers used at work. And she noticed immediately. And after she noticed, she would grab his wrist and she would say to him this: "Don't do that, you could seriously harm someone with that stuff." The detective would answer, "Is it harmful? Is it like the stuff you gave your little siblings?" And at this point, per the detective's account, it was written all over her face. But he had just stared into her eyes in silence until she spoke again. Peter would continue, "It was me who killed the 4 of them. The first 3 by order of my mother." And the detective would say in the last one, Peter would say back to him, "I killed him myself alone. I acted on my own." 12. She's 12. Oh my god. So this was the moment detectives had been waiting for. She explained her methods with chilling precision during an interrogation. How she turned potassium chloride cyanide and DDT-based insecticides into tiny lethal pellets, then mixed them into milk and fruit. What the fuck, dude? What, she's fucking 12. It's just horrifying. And each child suffered agonizing deaths, roughly taking 30 minutes. Only Fu and Kata had time to cry out, saying, "Quick, come here, I'm dying." And Pete had heard her and then just walked away. So the 12-year-old girl who kept the house running while her parents worked, who changed diapers, fed bottles, put her siblings to sleep, murdered 4 of her own siblings. And these were not moments of rage. They weren't revenge. They were planned, repeated, and refined murders. Basically a child behaving like a trained assassin. So after all this, her parents were held for a little bit longer, especially after she said that her mom was involved in all of this turret. And then her story just kept changing. In one version, her mother ordered the killings, and in another, it was all her idea. So a pathological liar, as well. Just fucking cherry on top. But eventually detectives concluded that was becoming more and more obvious that Pete had just lied. So her surviving siblings were removed from both parents' custody and placed under Child Protective Services. And Andres, the father, was released in March 1966. And Antonia, who gave birth actually in custody, was not released until May. And Pete, she was brought before a juvenile court and she would be sent to a psychiatric institution for observation before her trial. And there she just thrived. She laughed with nurses and befriended the staff. And psychologists were just alarmed because she was found to have, a sound mind. She wasn't just some crazy little kid. She knew what she was doing. She was very smart in the scariest way. Very Ed Kemper-like, if you know who that is. If not, I'm going to be doing a deep dive on him next, cause my god. But she reminds me of him a lot. Extremely calculated. And they said that she was fully aware of right and wrong, but capable of ignoring morality when it suited her. And by the summer of 1966, Pete was officially diagnosed as a psychopath. Which, shit. And in one of her many confessions, she summed up her motive simply: I was tired of taking care of them. Just called this as just a cold, hard bitch. Oh my god, so sickening. But she could not be tried as an adult. Spanish law wouldn't allow it, as she was only 12 years old and under the age of being criminally responsible. So instead, the judge ordered that Pete be committed indefinitely to the Catholic institution called Los Obilat as his turret. Basically a convent, not a prison, which is what she should have been in. My god. And it was here behind these walls that one of the youngest serial killers in all of history would grow up. But she didn't rebel. She didn't lash out. In fact, the nuns described her as very social. She even took up knitting, which she devoted a significant portion of her spare time to. So this wasn't the behavior of a child that was racked with guilt. It was something else entirely. She just did not care about anything other than herself. And as years passed, Pete just settled into the life at the convent. And she often would speak about her future, the possibility of moving in with her Aunt Loli, a quiet woman who lived alone and had no children of her own. Thank God. And in time, Pete would be released. And there's no definitive answer of what happened after her time at Los Obilat as Zoe. Some believe that she assumed a new identity. Others believe that she became a nun at Los Obilat as her, but she seemingly just vanished, leaving us to wonder what became of one of Spain's and the world's most juvenile offenders. So Margit, Jasmine, and Pete, 3 names etched into the shadows of true crime history, all of which took the lives of others. It's just unimaginable and leaves questions behind that society still struggles to answer. What makes a child kill? Are these stories of nature or nurture? Are children actually born different or broken or cold? Was the systems that they were raised in what failed them? What caused them to do what they did? Margit never knew stability. Jasmine grew up in safety but fell under the spell of fantasy and obsession. And Pete was crushed under the weight of adult responsibility long before she was old enough to read. So 3 children, 3 psychological profiles. One sadistic with no understanding of morality. One rebellious and emotionally stunted. And one highly intelligent but void of empathy. All of which society didn't know what to do with it. So the question remains, when a child takes a life, who is held accountable? The child, the family, the society and circumstances that made them men. Or maybe I don't have the right answer yet. I have no idea. I don't know. But I do know that this one was highly disturbing. And if you made it to the end, I appreciate you. I hope you're staying safe out there. Let me know what other cases you guys want me to go over down below. And until next time, I will see your beautiful face okay. Stay safe out there. Bye, guys.